Okay, we're back for part 3 of book number 1411, entitled The Real Thomas A. Edison by A.L. Shams. And it's a bit deceiving because we're no longer reading about Thomas Edison. We are now reading about Ignatius Donnelly. And I'll continue. Saddled occasionally, it was probably his nearest approach to actual agricultural pursuits. His political career was nearly over. In 1886, he was elected a member of the State House of Representatives for 2 years, but the groups to which he now belonged could hope for none but local successes, and Donnelly declined the status of a perpetual minority candidate. His far more important literary career was just beginning. There have been many, alas, too many, agrarian politicians in this fair land, but there has been only one Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, the world of science had placed at its disposal a volume entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Hon Ignatius Donnelly of Minnesota. From internal evidence, most of Donnelly's books were printed either directly at his own expense or by local publishing houses, probably subsidized by him. Atlantis went into the vexed question of a submerged Atlantic continent from every angle: geological, archaeological, botanical, zoological, and historical. It was a mine of odd scraps of information, all brought to bear, some of them by rather violent pushings and pullings, upon the author's enthusiastic advocacy of the Egyptian priest bedtime story of Solomon. Now, it is by no means certain, even yet, that the Atlantean legend is an unfounded myth. Spence and Bjorkman and Le Plugin have brought cognate arguments to bear in its favor, and an expedition equipped as no previous one has been is even now exploring the depths of the ocean below the Canaries and the Azores. Donnelly may yet be vindicated, though his antediluvian interpretation will have to depart from the Noachic flood itself, to which, together with the creation myth, he seemed paradoxically to cling when all the rest of his jejune theology had gone up in the mist of enlightened deism. But Governor Donnelly was not one to hem and haw, to state with scientific caution, to build up gingerly his probable evidence. What he believed he knew, and what he knew he proclaimed aloud and raucously. Atlantis startled the lay world and provided for many of later generations, including this humble chronicler, the first youthful insight into the wonders of archaeology. But the scientific pundits, when they noticed that battle cry from Minnesota, at all snickered politely. Eccentric geological theories is the kindest of their critical notes. Nothing daunted the eager Ignatius, like a spirited horse which has just learned the delights of running away, galloped into a new geological road. The very next year he published Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel. Nothing just like it has appeared since, until Charles Fort published The Book of the Damned in 1919 and New Lands in 1922. The contention of Ragnarok, the Swedish title of which is evidently a delicate compliment to the governor's constituents, is that the various glacial epochs of particularly the great ice age of the Pleistocene were caused by a great comet striking the earth, producing an enormous, if localized, conflagration. This intense heat, occurring preceding the main ice age of which we have evidence in the Pliocene, when it met the cold air of the upper atmosphere, caused an immense snowfall, culminating in the formation of gigantic ice sheets. When Donnelly derives his evidence from mythology, he is on pretty safe ground, and is something more than plausible. We have learned to look respectfully on the traditions of primitive peoples, and to inquire for their kernel of fact. His geological proofs are less convincing, even when the state of geology in his day is considered, and when he begins to plead for the high plane of civilization among Pliocene peoples, his ardor carries him rather wildly away. Once more he had presented a mass of suggestive material, a bit dragged in by the ears. Heaven had not intended Ignatius Donnelly for a scientist, but he is a great ensign. The realm of orthodox science again stood aloof. The lay reviewers were a bit squeamish and did not know quite what to say. The current criticism, varied from the apocalyptic tone of the New York Churchman, shows how it's the earth's dissolution, so clearly described in Peter's second epistle, may be accomplished. To the rather ambiguous remark of the Philadelphia Telegram, Mr. Donnelly has presented the scientific world with another nut. Apparently the world was not ready for a new geological dispensation. The governor, accustomed to delicate diagnosis of psychic reactions in the political world, abandoned his interest in the past of this planet. A new and permanent enthusiasm was taking its place. In 1888, the great cryptogram appeared. Perhaps it was delving into the esoteric meaning of myths that gave Donnelly his first impetus toward the disemboweling of Shakespeare. He was not the first to propound the theory that the great plays had an outer and inner seeming, that they contained a cipher on the Francis Bacon, or that Francis Bacon was their real progenitor. But in America he became and has remained the chief authority for this viewpoint, and he pursued it with his customary indefatigability. Before he got through, Bacon was the author not only of Shakespeare's plays, but also of Marlowe's and Green's, Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, and the Montanet's essays. Moreover, in all these works there was hidden a secret story, constituting a private history of England in Bacon's time, and of his own career, as well as various uncomplimentary biographies of the alleged writers of these classics. The battle, of course, still rages. Ciphers are too easy to play with, not to attract perpetually the puzzle-minded. Donnelly followed the great cryptogram with several other volumes on the subject, the chief one being the cipher in the plays and on the tombstone, published in 1899. The thesis in this latter volume is that the facts in the great mystery are now and have been since Bacon's time in the possession of the Rosicrucians, whose founder, whose English superior writes a Rosicrucian commentator in the copy in my possession. He was that it is this mysterious order which paid for all the early printed editions of Shakespeare, which will make the truth known at some future date, designated by the great Lord Verulam, and which follows with hideous persecution all those who, like Donnelly, endeavor to anticipate the date of revelation. Undoubtedly, to most persons, Ignatius Donnelly is known only as the partisan of Bacon against Shakespeare. He worked himself into a mighty hatred for the poor bard of Stratford, Stratford, and called him names which must be shocking to all a Shakespeare Society's ear. And he did an enormous amount of labor on the cipher. The fact that similar ciphers can be constructed, proving that anybody you please wrote anything you desire, dashed him not at all, but inspired him only to impassioned invective. The further fact that the kind of man who could be induced for money to acquiesce in so huge a fraud on the public would be precisely the kind of man who could never keep the secret. Does not seem to occur to him at all, nor to other and subsequent Baconarians, though he does allege that Ben Jonson, whose works incidentally were really written by Bacon, was sent as a good Rosicrucian to keep the old actor from talking too much after his retirement, and implies that Jonson deliberately achieved his end, and hence his master safely, by tempting Shakespeare to the mighty potations which caused his sudden death. One either is or is not a Baconian, and if one is not, it is perhaps impossible to judge fairly those who are. All that can be said of Donnelly's gargantuan toil is that it seems a fearful waste of misdirected energy. He was still sniffing footprints and examining hairs when he died. He would have made a marvelous detective. But not even the hounding of Shakespeare could consume all that remarkable store of vigor. Donnelly continued to guide the destinies of the farmers. He dropped novels. Dr. Huguenot and the Golden Bottle were the most successful in his way, and in 1890 he produced the utopian novel of which every writer is guilty at least once. It fired the American mind, particularly the mind of George F. Babbitt's father, to the extent of 60,000 sales in its first year, and it spread abroad until 3 different firms had republished it in English, and the faithful and grateful Swedes and Norwegians saw to its translation into their native tongues. The main theme of Caesar's column, the opus referred to, seems to be kind to the working man, or he may get wild. It is the Bible of the middle-of-the-road liberal and labor sympathizer. I have a shrewd suspicion that Jack London conned it well before he wrote The Iron Heel. From a more Marxian viewpoint, in fact, it would surprise me to learn that London had not been a pretty close student of all of Donnelly's works. Its chief interest today, however, is not in its graphic description of the horrors of the proletarian revolution, but in the successes and failures of its prophecies. More canny than London, who timed his revolution for 1912, Donnelly dates his in 19 blank. Some of his guesses are pretty good for 1890. He foresaw dirigibles with aluminum bodies, poison gas, and television, and some luxuries we have not yet achieved, such as elevated glass-covered sidewalks, street lighting by harnessing the aurora borealis, and entire furnished rooms which wandered from floor to floor like elevators. But his 20th century citizens who enjoy all those advantages still travel by horse and carriage, and women still wear long hair and sweeping skirts, perhaps before 19 blank. As a memory we shall return, heaven fortend, to these latter fashions, but the development of the horse into a zoological specimen never entered Donnelly's mind. A decade of activity still remained to the governor in 1895. With fond memories of greenback days, he wrote The American People's Money. But for finance he could not assume the ardor that possessed him naturally for geology or literary excavation or peeps into the future. The chief event of the 90s for him was his second marriage. The bride of 1855 had died, and their children were all grown. At 67, Ignatius took unto himself Marion, the young daughter of Barton Hanson, a well-known resident of Minneapolis, to whom the cipher in the plays and on the tombstone is dedicated. He left the farm forever and settled in the city, which was his new wife's home. It was at the residence of his father-in-law during a New Year's visit there that he died. Caesar's Column is subtitled A Novel of the 20th Century. At 3 minutes past midnight on the first day of the century, Ignatius Donnelly died. He had been seized by an attack of heart failure. New York's receptions in those days were strenuous experiences for men of 70, and by the time the physician arrived, his patient had no need of him. A contemporary newspaper portrait shows an interesting face, obviously Celtic in its antecedents, a hint of the professional orator in its full mouth and Byronesque chin, with a high broad forehead that is likely to house an eager inquiring mind. A sort of epitome of the American 19th century was this Ignatius Donnelly. A touch of Barnum about him, a flip of La Follette, a good deal of pure, unadulterated Donnelly. He might have been a naturalist, a critic, even a poet. He is conceivable as a great criminal lawyer, or as the spokesman of some party fallen upon friendlier soil than that which nourished his latter political loves. One thing he certainly was, one of the most curious specimens ever to grace a desk in the House of Representatives of the United States of America. And I think we'll stop there, because that's the end of that one.